Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban says his military may have sent drones into Ukraine because he doesn't consider it to be a sovereign country. If you're curious about the definition of sovereign, it just means a country having full and independent authority over itself, which Hungary claims Ukraine doesn't have because they are so heavily funded and influenced by NATO. I would like to remind Hungary's Prime Minister that they receive 75% of their natural gas and about 60 to 80% of their oil from Russia. Hungary also receives 100% of its nuclear material for their nuclear power plants from Russia, aside from receiving up to $1 billion a year in funding from that same country. So I'm wondering, can Orban use the same argument on himself and Budapest? Now, with the exception of Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban is by far the most hated politician in all of Europe because he just echoes Kremlin talking points. He is clearly corrupt, and he is an authoritarian leader in a NATO nation. But instead of talking about how awful he is or how much of a Russian asset he is, I'd like to make a distinction and suggest that he is merely a self-serving actor, and he doesn't really care who he pledges allegiance towards, but he knows his bread is actually buttered by NATO. But before I talk about how his bread is buttered by NATO, I want to talk about how he doesn't really have any loyalty to the Kremlin in this recent article about Orban saying that Russia has already won. He has claimed that the war is already decided, the Russians have won, and the only question is when and with whom they make peace. But listen to the next part. He adds that Russia allegedly can't harm Hungary as it's weak militarily, economically, and demographically. He went on to further say, "We are stronger, but we behave as if we are weaker." And it gets better. He said if Russian drones cross Hungary's territory, we will simply shoot them down. We're not afraid. In June of this year, 2025, Hungary's prime minister said that Russians only understand the language of force. And aside from trashing Ukraine, he also trashed Russia in saying that he was not worried about Russia attacking NATO countries, as the Russians are too weak for that. They can't even defeat Ukraine. This is not the rhetoric I expect to see of somebody who was supposed to be in the pocket of the Kremlin or Vladimir Putin. He is simply a corrupt individual who is taking as much advantage as possible from both sides. If he was completely on Russia's side, he would never have agreed not to veto NATO support for Ukraine as long as Hungary is not forced to help out. That sounds like someone who just doesn't want to do any of the heavy lifting, not someone who is trying to help Russia. There is a strength of NATO that a lot of authoritarian regimes consider to be a weakness, is that they have to have all 32 countries in consensus to actually pass any motion, especially when it comes to taking on new members, like Sweden and Finland. And while Hungary put up a fight, they eventually conceded to letting these two countries join, which is something Vladimir Putin would have never allowed if Orban was his puppet. And about Hungary's prime minister knowing where his bread is buttered, NATO, we just have to look at a map. Hungary is right next to war-torn Ukraine, which isn't too far from Belarus or Russia. And Russia is looking to attack and exploit any non-NATO country that he possibly can. If Hungary is no longer in NATO, or if NATO really does become fractured and weak, then Hungary doesn't get to enjoy the protection of the most powerful alliance in the history of the planet. If Hungary ever did anything too stupid to get itself really kicked out of NATO, then Russia would all of a sudden be funding these uprisings happening all over the country in which there was no sign of years before. When it comes to money, up until 2023, NATO countries were the largest sources of foreign direct investment, including Germany and the United States. But South Korea comes in as a close second. But interestingly enough, as of 2025, Asian countries have been the largest sources of foreign direct investment in this country. And it's a toss-up between Japan, South Korea, or China. When it comes to overall investment in Hungary, Russia can't compete with China, Japan, or any of the NATO countries, especially as a single bloc. If you look at it through this lens, you realize that Viktor Orban of Hungary isn't anyone who's pro Russia. He is just a corrupt human being who doesn't know how to efficiently run a country or an economy. So he is just taking as much advantage as he can of Russia for the very cheap sources of energy so his economy doesn't completely collapse. And of course, he is extorting NATO to get as much money and other resources as he can. And as horrible as it is to say, that can actually be something very useful, especially if you're the United States. If you're someone who doesn't play ball or cooperate with the West and you have integrity about this, then you're. But if you're corrupt, then you are very open to material suggestion. And that is something that America is very good at exploiting. And having at least one or two NATO leaders who are actually meeting with the enemy is pretty useful because all of the other countries can sanction and forswear and everything while speaking to the two dark horses or pariahs that actually communicate with Putin to find out what's going on. I don't like that at all. I would rather Hungary have a leader with integrity who is on Ukraine's side. That's a win-win. But unfortunately, this is what NATO and the Hungarian people have to deal with. I am the Geo Hussar, and when do you guys think that Hungary will be free of the stain of Viktor Orban? Thanks for watching.